The Gemara on Daf Daled Amud Beis taught us that everybody agrees that we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. We had a number. We had our Mishnah, we had a number of Braisos. Everybody agrees we don't read Megillah on Shabbos. And the Gemara asked, why? Why don't we read Megillah on Shabbos? And the Gemara brought two reasons. First it said, Amar Rabba, this is at the bottom of the page, 5 lines from the bottom. Amar Rabba, Rabba says, Hakol chayavim mikriyas Megillah, ve'en hakol b'kiyim b'mikra Megillah. Everybody's obligated to read the Megillah, but not everybody knows how. Gezerah shema yitlena biyado ve'elech yitzal baki lilmod v'yavirena arba amos b'rishus harabim. So the rabbis were concerned and they decreed that you can't read Megillah on Shabbos because we're afraid somebody might take his Megillah in his hand and carry it 4 amos in the public domain, which would be a desecration of Shabbos, and therefore he would take it to learn how to read it, and therefore they said we don't read Megillah on Shabbos. And the Gemara says that's the same reason why we don't blow shofar on Shabbos if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, and Hainu Taimid Lulav, that's why we don't take Lulav on Shabbos if on whichever day of Sukkot is Shabbos, even the first day, which is the D'oraisa day. So that's one answer. Then the Gemara says, Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef says, Mipnei she'einein she'aniyim nisuos b'mikra Megillah, because the eyes of the poor are raised up towards the time of reading the Megillah. That's when, the day we read the Megillah, that's when people are giving out matanos l'avionim, that's when they're giving out gifts to the poor, and if they would read Megillah on Shabbos, you can't give out money on Shabbos, and the poor would lose out on this opportunity to get charity, and therefore, says Rav Yosef, we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. We want to make sure to only read the Megillah on a day where we can also give out money to the poor. So we have two reasons here. Now, is Rav Yosef coming to argue on Rabbah and say, no, your reason, Rabbah, doesn't apply over here by Megillah. The concern that somebody might carry doesn't apply by Megillah, and he's therefore giving a different reason? Or does he agree with Rabbah and he's just adding a second reason which will have some nafkamina, some practical difference, that by adding a second reason? So Tosfos, the bottom Tosfos on the page, takes the second approach. And he says, Al karchach tarech lomar, it has to be that we say, De Rav Yosef lo paleg atame de Rabba, that Rav Yosef does not argue on Rabbah's reasoning, De hagabe shofar v'lulav lekatay machrina. Because when it comes to shofar and lulav, that we don't blow shofar on Shabbos, we don't take lulav on Shabbos, there's no other reason offered. Nobody gives any other reason. Everybody agrees to Rabbah's reason that the concern is that we might carry it. And therefore, the same will apply by Megillah. We should have the same concern that you might carry it to go learn how to do it. But mikol makom ka'amar hachatay machrina. But yet here he wanted to add a second reason, an additional reason. Mishum de'eka nafkusa miya. Because there is some nafkamina, there's some practical difference. In other words, if there was no practical difference by adding a second reason, what would be the point of adding a second reason? It must be that he's adding something by saying, and there's an additional reason why we don't read, and that makes a difference. How does that make a difference? B'mikdash, in the Beis HaMikdash, deleka shvus, because in the Beis HaMikdash we don't apply rabbinic restrictions that you can't do this because you might come to do this. In the Beis HaMikdash we don't have shvusim. So we would say that in the Beis HaMikdash it's okay to read the Megillah on Shabbos because we're not concerned. We don't say, oh, we're concerned you might carry it there. Because in the Beis HaMikdash we don't have these restrictions. But, even though technically, because of that reason, we would still be allowed to read Megillah in the Beis HaMikdash, but comes Rav Yosef and says, no, afilu hachi aser. No, still, it's forbidden. Mishum haisvara dekam Rav Yosef, because of Rav Yosef's second idea, which is that we want to only read the Megillah on a day that you can give money to the poor. So if we only had Rabbah's reason, we would say, well, that doesn't apply in the Beis HaMikdash, and you should read the Megillah on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash. But when Rav Yosef adds the second reason and says, but there's another reason, which is because we want to have the Megillah read on a day that you can give money to the poor, so that would apply even in the Beis HaMikdash. Even in the Beis HaMikdash, they should only read on a day where they can then go out and give money to the poor. So according to Tosfos, these two, Rav Yosef is not coming to argue on Rabbah, rather he's just adding a second reason which he feels is necessary, and for that specific case, for the Beis HaMikdash, that even in the Beis HaMikdash we wouldn't read Megillah on Shabbos. So that's Tosfos. So I want to share with you two other possibilities in the Achronim, in the later commentaries, that the Pnei Yoshua and the Turei Even. And both want to argue that it's possible that actually Rav Yosef is coming to argue on Rabbah. Now, what was Tosfos' proof that it can't be that Rav Yosef is arguing on Rabbah? So Tosfos said, because what about shofar and lulav? Certainly, over there we don't find any other reason. We know we don't take them on Shabbos. We don't blow shofar on Shabbos. We don't take lulav on Shabbos. No other reason is given. It must be Rav Yosef agrees to this reason. So both the Pnei Yoshua and the Turei Even, each in their own way, say, well, it's true that Rav Yosef must agree by shofar and lulav, but that doesn't mean he has to agree by Megillah, because there is certainly a possible distinction. And this distinction will revolve around that shofar and lulav are Torah commandments, they're mitzvos d'oraisa, and Megillah is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And maybe that makes a difference here. And each one presents it in his own way. So the Pnei Yoshua says as follows. Pnei Yoshua, first of all, is a little bit more, he doesn't have a problem specifically with what Tosfos says. But he says, if not for what Tosfos said, I would say something else. And that is that maybe Rav Yosef agrees specifically by lulav and shofar, which are mitzvos d'oraisa. There we're concerned somebody might carry it. Why are we concerned? Because a person might say that, I know it's Shabbos, I know I'm not allowed to carry, but he might think that the mitzvah is docha Shabbos. Carrying should be docha Shabbos, it should override Shabbos. And in fact, as says the Pnei Yoshua, there is an opinion like that. There's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that Rabbi Eliezer de Mila, that machshirei mitzvah are docha Shabbos, that the preparations for a mitzvah also can override Shabbos. And so the carrying of a lulav, or the carrying of a shofar, would override Shabbos. Now we don't paskin that way, and therefore it doesn't override, and therefore we need to have a gezerah, lest somebody come to carry. But specifically, says the Pnei Yoshua, because there is a mitzvah, a Torah mitzvah, that's why somebody might think that it's okay to carry the shofar or the lulav, and they might think that overrides Shabbos, and therefore we say, therefore you can't blow shofar or read or shake the lulav on Shabbos at all, because we're afraid somebody will make that mistake and come to carry on Shabbos. Masha'en kein, as opposed to Megillah, which is only a d'Rabbanan, and everybody knows it's only d'Rabbanan, it's only a rabbinic mitzvah, so nobody is going to think that the rabbinic mitzvah should of Megillah will, and carrying the Megillah would override Shabbos, and nobody is going to come to carry the Megillah on Shabbos. And therefore Rav Yosef disagrees, and Rav Yosef says that we don't have the gezerah over here. We don't. Rabbah's reason, the idea that you might carry, does not apply by Megillah. Nobody will think that you'll carry. This is, again, Rabbah holds they will, but Rav Yosef comes and says, no, nobody will think that you're allowed to carry the Megillah, and therefore they won't make that mistake. Nobody's going to come to carry the Megillah to learn how to read it. Everybody will know that the d'Rabbanan on the Megillah and the preparation for that d'Rabbanan does not override Shabbos. But there's a different reason why we don't read it on Shabbos, and that other reason is because we want to make sure that you can give money to the poor on the day that we read the Megillah. That's the approach of the Pnei Yoshua. The Turei Even has a different approach. Now, the Turei Even actually had a problem with what Tosfos says. He disagrees with what Tosfos says and brings proofs that the nafkamina, the specific practical application that Tosfos said of whether you can read the Megillah in the Beis HaMikdash, that according to the first reason you'd be able to, he doesn't think that that's actually correct. And that leads him really to offer an alternative approach to Tosfos, and along the same lines as the Pnei Yoshua, that actually Rav Yosef will disagree with Rabbah and holds that Rabbah's reason, the reason that you might come to carry, does not apply by Megillah. And he sets it up as follows. So he notes that what is the concern when it comes to Megillah or Lulav or Shofar? So if you take a look at Rashi, so Rashi says, Hakol, and really the Gemara says, like everybody's obligated in it. What does that have to do with anything? Why is that important? Everybody's obligated in it. So Rashi says, Umitoch shu mechuyev b'davar, because you have an obligation, hu bahu latzei sidei chova. You're very concerned to fulfill that obligation, and you'll get mixed up, and that's why you might end up carrying, because it's so important, such an important mitzvah, I might come to carry it. So it's the obligation of the mitzvah that will drive a person to make the error that they can carry it. And really, he points out that this is more explicit in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah by shofar, when the Gemara talks about the same thing, that you can't carry a shofar because you might come to carry it. You can't blow shofar on Shabbos because you might come to carry it. The Gemara says everybody's chayiv in it, and it uses that same language. Sorry, it's not more explicit, but it uses that same language. It's because everybody is chayiv in it, and it's that obligation that causes behilus. It causes a person to just lose track of what they're supposed to be doing, and that's what will drive them to come to carry it. Now, the implication from that would be that Rabbah's gezerah only applies by a mitzvah, and it could be the mitzvah of shofar, it could be the mitzvah of lulav, it could be the mitzvah of Megillah. But because a person has a mitzvah, has an obligation, that's what's going to throw them off and cause them to err and carry on Shabbos. And that's why we say you can't do any of those things on Shabbos. But says the Turei Even, that's not exactly correct, because we find that Rabbah has this gezerah even in a situation which does not involve a mitzvah or an obligation that needs to be fulfilled right now. And why is that? It's a Gemara or a Mishnah in the Gemara in Maseches Beitza. The Mishnah there really implies, the Gemara infers, that we do not immerse vessels, kelim, on Shabbos. So this would be relevant for the Tevilas kelim that we do nowadays, toveling dishes. We can't do that on Shabbos, or Yom Tov for that matter. And it will also apply for Tumah, if in days where the laws of Tumah, of ritual purity, impurity were practiced, so you have to immerse something that became Tameh to purify it. So we don't do that on Shabbos, and the question is, why not? So Rabbah says, because we're afraid you might carry it. You might carry it 4 amos in Rosh Hashanah. The same thing, same type of takana. You can't tovel things on Shabbos because you might carry it. Now, what about Yom Tov? Why can't you tovel on Yom Tov? You're allowed to carry on Yom Tov if there's a need. So he says it's a gezerah atu Shabbos, because if we allow you to do it on Yom Tov, you might come to do it on Shabbos. Okay, but bottom line is Rabbah says that there's a concern that you might carry your vessel to tovel it on Shabbos. Now that's not an obligation to do right now. It's not a mitzvah. It's not necessary to do right now. There's no reason a person should be so bahul in it, and yet they should be so concerned and lose track and do it, because what's the rush? There's no obligation riding on them. So, and yet Rabbah says it over there. So we see that even for a matter of rishus, something that's optional, Rabbah is concerned that you might come to carry. Rav Yosef, by the way, over there, gives a different reason. Rav Yosef, just like over here, he gives a different reason. Rav Yosef says over there, the reason why you can't immerse vessels on Shabbos or Yom Tov is because we're afraid you might come to squeeze them. And Shema Yischot, you might squeeze them. And that's a malacha on Shabbos. It's part of the process of doing laundry, of cleaning something, is squeezing it out. And that's the concern. And that would apply equally to Shabbos and Yom Tov. And that's why you can't immerse vessels. Now, obviously a dish, we're not concerned about that, but because you might immerse a garment, so we still have that, that's the concern, and therefore you can't immerse any vessels. So says the Turei Even, the following calculation within Rabbah. He says, really, Rabbah holds that it applies. There's a concern you might carry even by something that's rishus, that's optional. Now that's what we call a chashash rachok. It's not so likely somebody's going to carry something to go and immerse it, but since it's optional anyways, then, and it's not our mitzvah specifically to go do that right now, so the rabbis in that case said, well, even though it's a distant chashash, it's not so likely, but we're still going to make that gezerah and forbid one to immerse vessels because they might come to carry them. But for a mitzvah, something that's a mitzvah, if such a chashash rachok, something that's so unlikely, the rabbis wouldn't have decreed on that. They wouldn't have forbade you to blow shofar for something so unlikely as just you might carry it. Except for one thing. It's not so unlikely when it comes to a mitzvah. When it comes to a mitzvah, says the Torah Yevon, that's the point that Rashi's stressing. A person is bahul. They're so involved in the mitzvah, then they might forget. They're more easily going to forget. And it's no longer lo shlicha. It's not unlikely that they'll carry it. It's actually very likely, he says, that they'll come to carry it. Because of that involvement and that obligation that's riding on them and that urgency, it's much more likely. So when it comes to a mitzvah, on the one hand we would say it's a mitzvah. The rabbis wouldn't forbid something that's a mitzvah because of such a distant concern. But on the other hand, that itself, because it's a mitzvah, actually makes the concern not so unlikely, not so distant, and therefore it's relevant to make that gezerah. So according to Rabbah, both by a devar rishus, both by something that's optional, it's not a mitzvah, we have the gezerah, that we can't do it because you might come to carry it by toveling vessels, even though it's unlikely, but it's not our mitzvah anyway, so we might as well make the decree. And on the flip side, something that is a mitzvah, on the one hand, we wouldn't have made the decree because it's a mitzvah and we don't want to prevent it from being able to do the mitzvah. But on the other hand, because it's a mitzvah, person's more lost in the obligation and they're more likely to carry it, and therefore it's not uncommon, it's more common, and therefore it's relevant to make that gezerah. What about Megillah? Megillah is right in the middle. Megillah is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic mitzvah. So do we say that it's like a devar rishus, it's like that's something optional, or do we say it's like an obligation and it's like a mitzvah? Now, according to Rabbah, it doesn't make a difference because Rabbah holds whatever you want to compare it to, it's forbidden. If you want to say it's a devar rishus, it's optional. It's something that's only a rabbinic mitzvah is like a devar rishus. It's like something optional. So, but we decree even in those cases. And if you want to say that it's a mitzvah, so then because it's a mitzvah, a person's bahul, they're mixed up, they have a sense of urgency to get it done, and they're more likely to make a mistake. Then we're gozer in that case too, and according to Rabbah, whatever you want to compare it to, we would have the decree that you can't read the Megillah on Shabbos. However, according to Rav Yosef, as we mentioned, when it comes to toveling your kelim, your vessels, Rav Yosef gave a different reasoning than Rabbah. Rav Yosef said the concern isn't that you might carry it. The concern is that you might squeeze it. In other words, Rav Yosef does not hold of the decree when it comes to devar rishus. When it comes to something that's optional, he doesn't hold that we would be gozer that you might come to carry it. It's so unlikely that you come to carry it. And therefore there's no decree on a matter of rishus. Only on a matter of a mitzvah, like a shofar or a lulav, where you're very bahul, there Rav Yosef will agree, and we know that he agrees. But something that's optional, we know he disagrees. We know that he doesn't hold that there's a gezerah, you might come to carry it and then be tovel your kelim. He says it's a different reason you can't tovel your kelim. It's because you might come to squeeze them. So what does Rav Yosef hold about Megillah, which is in the middle? So says the Torah Yevon, Rav Yosef holds that you need to give a different reason for Megillah too. That's what you see from our Gemara. He has to give a different reason because Rav Yosef actually compares reading the Megillah more to a matter of rishus, something that's optional. It's only a rabbinic mitzvah. The person won't get all lost in the obligation, and therefore it's not shliach. It's not likely that he'll come to carry it, And if it's not likely, then the Rabbanon were not gozer, they didn't decree in that situation. And if you were just coming from that you might come to carry it, they wouldn't have decreed that you can't read Megillah on Shabbos. That's why Rav Yosef comes and gives a different reason. That's why Rav Yosef comes and says that the reason is because the aniyim, the poor people, we need to have Megillah reading on a day that you can give out money, and that's why we don't read it on Shabbos. But not because a person will come to carry it, because it's so unlikely that we don't make a gzeira in this case. So to just quickly summarize, we said according to Tosfos said it has to be that Rav Yosef agrees to Rabbah, because we know he agrees when it comes to shofar and lulav, so he must agree to Rabbah's reasoning by Megillah as well, that you can't read it on Shabbos because you might come to carry it. Then why did he give another reason? He gave another reason because in the Beis Hamikdash the first reason we're going to apply, and that's why he had to give a second reason. But the Pnei Yehoshua and the Turei Even both suggest that it could be Rav Yosef disagrees. Rabbah, he agrees to Rabbah, he agrees the decree you might come to carry it is true by lulav and shofar. The Pnei Yehoshua says because those are mitzvos d'oraisa, and since they're mitzvos d'oraisa, a person might think that the preparation for those mitzvos override Shabbos, and you're allowed to carry them, and a person will make that mistake, and that's why Rav Yosef will agree that we have a gezeira in those cases. But in the case of Megillah, which is only D'Rabbanan, nobody will think that carrying the Megillah should override Shabbos, and nobody will make that mistake. And therefore, we would not make a gezerah for that reason. That's why Rav Yosef has to give a second reason. That's the Pnei Yehoshua. And the Turei Even said a different idea. Again, the difference is D'Rabbanans versus D'Oraisas, but that Rav Yosef held that on something that's unlikely, that's lo shliach, we don't make this gezerah, like by Tvilas Kalim, by Tovel and Kalim. It's only by something that's more likely, and only a mitzvah d'oraisa Rav Yosef considers likely that somebody might carry it because somebody's so bold or so concerned about the urgency to get that mitzvah done. That's what makes it likely, and that's where we would make a gezerah. But something that's not shliach, we wouldn't make a gezerah. And Rav Yosef compares Megillah to a matter of rishus. He doesn't think that obligation will cause a person to be bahol, to get mixed up, and therefore it remains in the realm of unlikely, and therefore there wouldn't be a gezerah, and if it was just for that, you'd be allowed to read Megillah on Shabbos, and therefore Rabbi Yosef comes and gives a different reason why you can't read Megillah on Shabbos.